Good day. President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has given an interview to Fareed Zakaria of CNN in which he's discussed US relations with China. I've not been able to find a transcript of this interview anywhere. None so far has appeared on the White House website, but there's a link to the video of this interview below. Now, some people have construed this video to be conciliatory towards China and to indicate that the United States now accepts the permanence and reality of China's political system. And indeed, Jake Sullivan does actually say that the United States made a mistake previously in believing that it could change or transform China's political system. He also says that the United States is not seeking to contain China and it is not aiming at a Cold War. And as I said, many people have construed these comments as being conciliatory towards China and paving the way for better relations with China. I, on the contrary, take the diametrically opposite view. Listening to this video, listening to this interview, what struck me immediately was the exceptionally strong ideological tone that Jake Sullivan was taking and the way in which Jake Sullivan frames competition between the United States and China overwhelmingly on the basis of ideology. Moreover, it is a very particular ideology. It's not an ideology that is rooted, or so it seems to me, in the ideas of the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the nature of American democracy, a political system, by the way, which at its height, when the Constitution was functioning in its most active and vibrant way, forswore intervention and regime change wars around the world and did not seek monsters, foreign monsters to slay. That's not the world, the ideology that Jake Sullivan looks to. On the contrary, if you listen to his words, if you consider them very carefully, the ideology that he's talking about, the one that he sets against China, is the ideology that on the Duran, Alex Christoforou and I, and by the way many other people, refer to as globalisation, a globalist system in which the US political elites are at the centre, where they set the rules through something which they call the rules-based international order, and to which everyone must adhere to. And fundamental to this globalist system that Jake Sullivan is talking about is the freedom of these elites to move capital freely around the world, to invest and place it wherever they choose, and to develop and structure the economies of all countries around that freedom and that privilege which these American elites believe they should be entitled to have. It's also, of course, a system, a globalist system, which by definition places not so much the United States, if one means by the United States the nation and its people, but the elite of the United States and the power structure, the power systems that they have created around themselves as the center and focus of the international system, in the same way that the emperor and the Senate were at the center of the Roman system, an earlier system of, if you like, partial globalization, one which replaced the republic which had existed in Rome before. Anyway, let's just consider some of his words. As I said, I've not been able to find a complete transcript, but there have been some excerpts from Jake Sullivan's comments in various newspapers. This one I'm taking from the British newspaper, The Independent. And The Independent sums up the interview as follows, and he says, America is not seeking a new Cold War with China, but looking for a system of peaceful coexistence. The goal here is not containment. It is not a new Cold War. It is rather a favourable disposition in which the US and its allies can shape the international rules of the road, interesting choice of words, on the sorts of issues that are fundamentally going to matter to the people of our country and to the people everywhere. International rules of the road. Clearly, what he is referring to here is the rules-based international order. And then he goes on to say that the objective of the Biden administration is not to seek any political transformation in China, but to shape the international order to favor its interests and other like-minded democracies. And Sullivan that goes on to say that the goal of US policy on China was to have the two major powers operate in an international system. We want the terms of that coexistence in the international system to be favorable to American interests and values. Note the word values. To be set up so that the rules of the road, again, reflect an open, fair, free Indo-Pacific region, an open, fair, free international economic system. Note those words about an open, fair, free international economic system, and where basic values, note the word values, and norms that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are respected in international institutions. There will be a competition as we go forward. The Chinese government does have a different approach to many of these issues, he admitted. But note, let's just pass some of these words carefully. We want the terms of that coexistence in the international system to be favourable to American interests and values. Note how Sullivan conflates America's interests, by which, of course, he means the interests of America's elites, and values. So he wants a moral order, or what he would call a moral order, which is favourable to the interests of US elites, the interests of the United States, by which, of course, a person like Jake Sullivan always means US elites. And notice that favourable system, a system favourable to American interests and values, has an open, fair, free international economic system where basic values and norms that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are respected in international institutions. That it has that at its heart. In other words, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is reinterpreted by US elites to translate into an open, fair, free international economic system where capital can be moved around the world without restriction by US elites in their own interests. It is, as I've discussed before, the weaponization of human rights in order to achieve economic and power objectives by certain elites in the United States and in what Jake Sullivan refers to as like-minded democracies in their own interests. It's, in other words, globalisation. And that's the purpose of all of this. And what Jake Sullivan is saying is that that is the objective of the United States, and what he wants is an international system based on that framework, but one in which China, despite having a completely different point of view, a point of view based on sovereignty and assertion of its national interests, is isolated and eventually obliged to subordinate itself. And of course, Jake Sullivan knows perfectly well that if that were ever to happen, the Chinese political system as it now exists would not be able to survive. So in effect, what Jake Sullivan is saying is that the United States wants competition with China, but it wants that competition in an environment in which the United States, not China, sets down the rules of the game in the knowledge that that is incompatible with the long-term viability of China's political system, and one which serves the interests of US elites and the elites of those other countries in what Jake Sullivan refers to as like-minded democracies. In other words, those countries that are in alliance with the United States, the Western countries, what is today referred to as the collective West. And all of this is rationalized and justified and placed on a moral basis by a reinterpretation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and by the weaponization of human rights in order to achieve this globalist objective. It's actually, when you work it out, quite a sinister, at least in my opinion, quite a sinister approach, one which tries to use human rights not in order to protect the rights of people so much, but in order to create an international system in which there will be an international economic system which is open and free, and in effect one which favours US elites and those of Western countries. It's quite an interesting set of ideas. I've no doubt that Jake Sullivan sincerely believes in this. I'm quite sure that as a obviously profoundly ideologically minded person, he sees the world, a world reshaped in this way, as somehow optimal for humanity, and no doubt he persuades himself that this will indeed lead to human rights and better prospects and conditions for most people. But as I said, it's quite clear that this is not a system, this international system. If China were ever to be isolated within it or to become subordinated to it, it's not one in which the Chinese political system would be able to survive. Indeed, it's debatable whether China, or indeed any country, would be able to survive as a truly independent, sovereign state within a system constructed like this. Now, I'm going to say two things. Firstly, as we're going to come to in a moment, the Chinese, who've been watching Jake Sullivan's interview carefully, have figured this all out. They know exactly what he and the Biden administration is up to. They understand the extent to which Biden and the administration and US elites remain committed to globalisation, and the fact that they are trying to impose it on China and indeed on all other countries. The Chinese are perfectly aware of this. They're prepared to resist this, and they understand the stakes involved and the risks involved if they go along with any part of this agenda that Jake Sullivan is setting out here. So that's one thing I'm going to say. The second is that Jake Sullivan's agenda, or the ideology that he espouses here, is one which, for a brief period in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was possible for US elites to embrace, and which might conceivably, in the power conditions which existed at that time, might have seemed like it was achievable. Today, with the radically different international situation, with China become a global superpower, with an economy which on purchasing power parity terms exceeds in size that of the United States itself, with China forging alliances with, especially with that other great nuclear superpower, a country, Russia, which General Mark Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, has now accepted and acknowledged is indeed a third superpower, with China having forged an alliance with Russia, and with China also having strong relations with many states, especially in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere. It's really quite impossible to imagine that this ideology, this globalist ideology that Jake Sullivan is advocating, has any prospect of being successfully imposed on people. It reminds me of some of the sort of commentaries that Soviet ideologues used to espouse in the late 1970s and early 1980s, about the Soviet Union and the rise and spread of the Soviet form of socialism around the world, even though the reality was that whatever possible factual basis there might have been to that ideology in the 1940s had entirely ceased to exist by the late 1970s and early 1980s, so that nobody believed that this ideology was actually a viable one, except those Soviet ideologues who continued to propound it. In other words, Jake Sullivan is not just an ideologue, he is an obsolete one. He is out of date. He continues to think of the world as it was in, say, 1994, or even, dare I say it, in 2001, not about the world as it exists today. And he is committing the United States to an ideological crusade to promote globalization on behalf of US elites, which therefore is certain to fail. This is really very extraordinary. And can I also say, it's also, in my opinion, the great source of international tension. It means that the United States is constantly restlessly probing, agitating, looking for ways to extend and promote its great ideological project, even though the reality is that with every year that passes, the chances of that ideological project being as effectively imposed are diminishing. And these constant attempts by the United States to expand and extend it are simply creating aggravation and tension in the international system, which is ultimately entirely destructive and is the major source, in my opinion, of all the problems. Anyway, let's come round to what the Chinese are saying about this, because there's been a long editorial about all of this in Global Times, and it's striking how cynical the Chinese are about it all, and how the Chinese have managed to see right through what Jake Sullivan is saying and what he's talking about. And the editorial starts in a relatively mild way with the title, the US must prove it no longer seeks to change China's system. Then we get to the editorial itself. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said in an interview with CNN, broadcast on Sunday, that one of the US's errors of previous approaches to policy towards China was a belief that through US policy, the Chinese system will fundamentally transform. Yet this is not the object of the Biden administration. Sullivan mentioned that the goal of America's China policy is to create a circumstance in which two major powers are going to have to operate in an international system for the foreseeable future. He added that the environment should be more favorable to the interests and values of the US and its allies and partners. As National Security Advisor, Sullivan said the US government is no longer trying to transform China's system. This can be regarded as a step in a positive direction for Washington. At the same time, we need to see the Democratic administration focuses on ideology a lot. Sullivan made such a statement not because the US has lost the will to transform China, but because the US has reluctantly accepted a reality. To transform China is something that the US cannot achieve. Transforming the world is the basic political thinking of the United States, which corresponds to its deep-rooted security concept. In other words, the United States is keen to change the systems and behaviors of other countries. In addition to its missionary mentality, it is more important to eliminate external threats and increase the US's security and interests by this means. The Soviet Union collapsed this way during the Cold War with the US. As a result, the United States has dominated the world as the sole superpower. This is a typical example of the US succeeding in reinventing an adversary. But more typically, instead of becoming a partner of the US and Europe by accepting the basic framework of Western institutions, Russia has been further attacked by the US because Russia is too powerful. Politically, Japan has been completely westernized and has maintained US military presence on its soil for a long time. Its rapid economic rise last century, shocked Washington, and the Japan threat became another major concern of US elites. The US took action and cracked down on Japan's competitiveness. This period of history tells people how much the US refuses to accept strategic challenges from the outside world. Behind the US's attempt to transform China is Washington's consistent prejudice against socialism. Apart from that, the US's fundamental goal is to dismantle the engine of China's emergence and break up China's mobilization and unity. If the US could succeed, such an approach could best consolidate US hegemony at the lowest cost. However, from the Trump administration, the US has become more and more frustrated with such propositions and tactics. It has especially lost confidence in achieving the goal through an engagement strategy, so the US started to shift its strategy towards containment against China, initiated by the Trump administration and continued and completed by the Biden team. Managing intense competition has become the new slogan of the Biden administration. The political elite in the United States will not accept the Chinese system. They actually just acknowledge the reality the Chinese system cannot be shaken externally, so instead they try to figure out what they can do to undermine the constant vitality that the Chinese system infuses into the country's development to eventually crumble the system. This is what the Biden administration means by intense competition. Whilst we are not hoping for Washington's strategic goodwill, we can still make use of Sullivan's statement in a positive way. After all, such a statement would help ease China-US relations, and we should ask the US to put that statement into action and reduce its political interference in China's internal affairs. Not pursuing to transform China's system is a way for the United States to shrink back from difficulties after acknowledging them. What has prompted the US to make such an adjustment is China's continued success and its increased political confidence that goes along with it. As China will continue to maintain its willpower and momentum of growth, the US's ambitions to encircle and suffocate China will be dismantled, and China's strong development will help continue the country's strategic initiative. So what the Chinese are saying here is this: the United States hasn't really given up on its ideology. It still wants to pursue globalization. It has an animus against socialism. Now, what the Chinese mean by socialism increasingly is China's ability to forge its own economic path in a way that suits Chinese national interests. That's what they mean when they talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, an economic system built around Chinese national interests. This is something that the United States urgently wants to dismantle, together with the political system that goes with it. And though the United States has very grudgingly accepted that the rise of Chinese power and the failure of previous engagement strategies means that China's political system is not going to be changed by the United States working from within, what the United States is still trying to do is to try to subordinate China to itself and to the interests of US elites by promoting this rules-based globalist international order, which it wants to use first to isolate China and then ultimately to suffocate it. That's what the Chinese are saying. And the Chinese are saying to themselves, we mustn't allow ourselves to be drawn into this system. Look what happened to the Soviet Union. Look what happened to Japan. This time we are going to be different. We are far stronger than the Soviets were. We are far stronger than the Japanese were. We have no reason to be awed or intimidated or seduced by the United States or by what US elites tell us. We should go ahead, forge our own path, build up our alliances with our true friends, countries like Russia, and build our own economic model based not on the interests of the United States, on US interests, on the interests of US elites, but our own interests, based on our own interests and our own aspirations for our own future. So the Chinese are aware of all of this, and in my opinion, they have, as they say, the means and the resources, especially now that they've teamed up with the Russians, to counter all of this. So when Sullivan talks about a global confrontation with China, one in which, in effect, China is isolated and forced to subordinate itself to US interests because it will be functioning within a globalized world in which the rules-based international order controlled by US elites prevailed. When Sullivan talks about all of this, he is talking about a world which does not exist. But I come back to something which I said earlier in this interview. The fact that Sullivan is apparently incapable of accepting the fact that his ideology is outdated and cannot be implemented doesn't unfortunately mean that he's prepared to modify it or give up on it in any significant way. He accepts that the United States doesn't for the moment have the means to change China from within, but in all other respects, he aims to persist with the policy that he is committed to, the ideological project of globalization that he is committed to. And given that his objective is to isolate China, it's difficult to see this as working in any other way than as a project to basically break down or detach from China, China's friends. So if one takes a step back and thinks through carefully what Sullivan means, it means, to my mind, that US policy towards Russia, is now going to become increasingly important. Either the US will try to talk the Russians to detach themselves from the Chinese, the better to isolate China, or if the Russians refuse to do this, they're going to try to beat them down. And the result is that we're going to see a complicated US policy, perhaps a US policy locked in contradictions, of the US blowing hot and cold towards Russia, trying on the one hand to draw Russia away from China, making all kinds of grand promises to Russia and to the Russians, which the Russians would be extremely unwise to take seriously, and which, by the way, they show no sign of taking seriously. Or alternatively, if that doesn't work, ramping up the pressure on Russia with the idea of breaking Russia so as to isolate China, so as to achieve the globalization project. It's a fantastic project, a completely utopian one. But as I've highlighted in my discussion, my words just now about what this means towards Russia, it means, ultimately, it can only mean a greater aggravation of international tensions. The reality, as I have said many times, is that these projects, these grand ideas of reshaping the whole world, of building a world around values, around globalization, around the free movement of capital, around all those sort of things, all of this is unachievable and unrealizable. It is instead, all it is doing is creating international tension, which is not needed and which is not necessary, and it is committing US resources to a quixotic ideological quest which is unachievable and which is only making enemies of more and more countries, and which is draining the US of resources. Far better for the US to do what I have urged it to do many times, which the Chinese and the Russians are both urging it to do also, which is to abandon this ideology of globalization, of the rules-based international order, of values, of the weaponization of human rights, and to accept instead, as was the case in the 19th and early 20th centuries, that the United States is one country amongst many. It is a country with many advantages, a constitutional system that has served the American people well, and which can indeed act as an inspiration to many others, but one which works best through example and not through this constant urge and need to meddle in others' affairs. And the way to stabilize the international system is not to try to change everybody and to reshape the world in this way. It is instead to accept the international system as it is and to negotiate that geostrategic ceasefire with the Chinese and the Russians that I have talked about. That means, as this Global Times editorial says, accepting China's political system. If the Chinese political system is going to change, it should change entirely because the Chinese people want it to change and want to modify it in a way that suits them, not because the United States wants to impose its values on China. And it also means accepting the political system, the political setup which exists in Russia. And it also means accepting and acknowledging that both China and Russia have red lines and core interests, and that it is in the US interest to accept those facts, especially since those red lines and core interests do not impinge on those of the United States. Well, this interview by Jake Sullivan, relatively short though it is, in my opinion, has highlighted the real duel that is taking place around the world. It is not a duel of democracies versus autocracies, as the Biden administration would have us believe. It is rather a duel between globalists or globalisationists, of whom the key grouping is contained within US elites, and those countries which continue to adhere to sovereigntist positions. Now, one might not always agree with what these sovereigntist states do within their own borders. One may often find that what they do is objectionable and offensive. One may not like these countries very much. But the point is that nations and peoples have a right to chart their own path, and sometimes to make mistakes as they chart that path by themselves. Ultimately, it seems to me that in this duel, it is the United States with its ideology of globalization that is the major cause of international tension, and it is the sovereigntist states that are the true status quo powers. It's not they who are trying to revise and change and shape the system. It is the United States, whilst it is controlled and under the ideology that I've just been discussing. It is the United States, in other words, which is the true revisionist, not the Chinese and the Russians, who, on the contrary, continue to take a law-based conservative view of international affairs. Anyway, on top of all of that, of course, there is the duel between the two great blocs, the United States and the collective West, and the Eurasians, led by China and Russia. But to the extent, as I said, that this is an ideological challenge, one should understand that it is the United States that is the ideological driver, not the Eurasians, who show no interest or sign of wanting to expand or extend their system. They would deny, in fact, that they even have a system, and who want instead to be left alone. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check us out on our various other platforms, of which the most important is Locals, where we're publishing an increasing amount of exclusive content, where I'm doing live streams, and where we have a thriving Duran community, which also publishes its own content. And you can also find us on other platforms like BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, and of course the new free speech platform, SuperU. And you can support us, if you like, via PayPal, not PayPal, but Patreon and Subscribestar, and also via our shop, where you can buy all the amazing things you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And also, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again shortly in future videos, and have a wonderful day. Until then.